Mr. Patrick O'Keefe, production designer. All right. Following Patrick, we have the amazing Tsai, visual development artist. Our third artist today is Octavio Enrique Rodriguez, head of story. And last but certainly not least, we have the amazing Kris, Anka, character designer. All right, now they have an amazing presentation for you, and I'll let Patrick take the mic, please.
All right. Hey, mic check in the back. We good? Out front, can you hear me? Great. Well, let's do a little quick introduction of who we got on stage here. So I am Patrick O'Keefe, production designer of Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse, previously the art director of Spider-Man Into the Spiderverse. We need a longer title. I got into animation actually when I started making Spider-Verse movies, really. I designed a lot of commercials before that and video games, and got my start as an artist actually the morning after I got arrested for doing graffiti. When the cops banged on my door to let my mom know I needed to show up to court, the phone rang and the Canada Arts Council was looking for a upstanding young gentleman to work with troubled youth and get them doing graffiti on the right walls. So I kind of balanced it out there and I was on my way.
Hey everyone, my name's Kat, and I was a visual development artist on this film. And prior to that, I've mostly been working on animation projects on the TV side. So I worked on some shows like Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts and Steven Universe. And yeah, I got my start in a very weird way actually, because I went to school to study psychology. And so when I found out for this movie they wanted me to draw a therapist's office, I was like, oh, perfect. I know exactly what to do for this one.
Hi, my name is Octavio Rodriguez. I was the head of story for Across the Universe. Before that, I was actually in London directing for Wrong's Gone Wrong. And before that, I was at Pixar for 6 years. And before that, Lucasfilm. So been doing a couple things here and there, and just happy to be here.
And I'm Kris Anka. I was the co-lead character designer on Across the Spider-Verse. And before that, I was at Marvel Comics for 8 years, and I'm very tired now.
We're all getting our rest now. All right, and we're here to take you on a journey across the Spider-Verse. Pun intended. This is a film that spans several different styles. That are curated to tell the unique qualities of each character, each scene, whether that's triumphant or terrifying. But before all these dimensions, we got to kind of take a step back and start from the beginning one more time. Is that how they say it? Something like that? It all started with the comic books, even the first film. This is a love letter to comic books, but not only to the comic books themselves, but our relationship with comic books. It is about the DNA of comic books and our experience of reading comic books. When you're a little kid and you got it kind of pressed up to your nose, you got the flashlight out because mom wants you to turn the lights off. And it's all about our boy Miles, and I think after having worked on 2 films, I can call him a boy because I really got to see him grow up. In 2011, he was created by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli. He's this very unique, he's a very unique spider. He's the new spider for the new generation. I think the character in the comic books was wholly formed, and we've just helped elevate that and tell his story in the films. When I say that this world is built on the DNA of, comic books, what I really mean is, like, when it comes to the physical properties of these films, the atoms that bind the world together, we are talking about comic book DNA. And so this is an example of, for anyone who doesn't know, comic books are printed on paper with ink, and that process is done with something called Ben-Day dots. These will make up the atoms that can build the entire world of Spider-Verse. But we also want it to feel like it's based on the real world, and so we're keen on making sure we observe all the worlds we're going to go to. For Miles's world, we went to Brooklyn, took tons and tons of photos, worked with street photographers there, people who grew up in Brooklyn and really got to know what this world is like, so we could put it on screen so it feels like a real place. So if something really bad happens, there's going to be real consequences. Miles is a unique superhero for one reason, I think, that most superheroes don't have in their life is they have a loving family. The best way to become a superhero, besides getting some radiation in you, is losing one of your parents somewhere. It's a good one. I recommend it. No, but Miles is a loving character, and I think this film, more than the first one, really delves into the family and the fact that, no matter who you are, as long as you're honest to yourself and the people around you, they're going to love you. And in this film, Miles also was able to get a worthy nemesis in the Spot. He did start sort of as the villain of the week, a bit of a mort, but he ended up becoming something next level, and we're going to see a little bit more of him as we continue to go across and beyond the Spider-Verse.
So what you're seeing here is just a breakdown of some boards exploration that we were doing. And the idea was just to get a sense of the playfulness. And so we just kind of worked out an exercise of this in this thing here. But again, it's like figuring out the range from it being comedic to later on seeing how he actually is very formidable. But this moment was just that, just trying to block out some scenes for it.
And I think one of the cool things about the Spot, like the opportunity we had in an animated film more than any other film, is like the gags we could play with them and splitting them apart. We get, the code name for the film was actually Whack-A-Mole, and in a lot of ways it ended up Spot and the posing and the boarding of it all really encapsulated that feeling of just trying to get your arms around it.
And a little bit of a combination too is that this was a back and forth. So as we have in the process of boards, there's actually a rough layout that was done, and then I did an overlay. So these are my boards, overlaying that just to get the custom idea for the camera work as well. So we could go back and forth and put it back into edit.
So now let's go across the Spider-Verse and discuss some of the key worlds, characters, and scenes. One of the biggest challenges, I think, on this film was bringing the world of Spider-Woman, Gwen Stacy on screen. These images here became our North Star. These are the comic book covers by Jason Latour and Robbie Rodriguez. They invented the character in 2014. And these became our guiding light for everything we did. Again, it's not just the comic books themselves, but our relationship to the comic books. These are the ones that the fans really know and come to associate with the character. What we love about these is the emotionality and the fluidness. Phil Lord, our executive producer, anytime I kind of got in trouble on the film, would just call me and be like, go back to the comic books, look to the comic books. That's the audience's experience. That's the expression that we were looking for. And so many of our palettes and even scenes are lifted straight from the comic books. But then, of course, we want to elevate these things. We wanted to take this idea of the fluidity of Gwen, the fluidity of her emotionality, and put it right on the screen. And what better way to do that than leaning into the fluidity of a wet medium like watercolors. We found tons of watercolors. We did lots of watercolors. We trained a computer to paint watercolors based off of our paintings, all in the hopes of finding a way to explain, this emotional fluidity that she's always in. While of course maintaining the graphic sensibility and design language that's so iconic in those covers. Tsai, incredible Viz Dev artist, and came on to do a lot of the color keys for this film. And I jumped forward. So when it came to breaking down Gwen's style, I'll come back to Kat in a second. Breaking down Gwen's style, we were looking for what makes this style so iconic, and how can we then take this idea and teach 1,000 artists basically to replicate it. So we broke it down into all these different principles. What would her line work be like that's different than Miles's? Miles is a very digital style. Gwen's very emotional style. It should be applied with texture and the feeling of the artist's hand. How are we going to handle form in this world? Again, emotional fluidity means that the forms themselves don't need to be rigid and structured, but can be washed away when they need to. When a sequence, boils down to strictly the emotionality between father and daughter, the rest of the world doesn't matter, and this whole world is just going to melt away. So, speaking of Kat, one of our biggest challenges then was, how do we take pure emotionality, let's throw logic, how many times did I say, get rid of the logic, let's throw away the logic and put the emotionality of the colors, her feelings right on screen.
Yeah, so just like Patrick was saying, we definitely wanted to try something really different with the color palettes in her world. So they're not at all true to what you might see in reality. They're very much so a reflection of how she's feeling in that particular moment. And we kind of treated it like a mood ring, so that Gwen's colors don't even need to necessarily match with the colors that you see in her environment. So in this scene, these are some earlier color keys, an earlier take on this moment, and we wanted to really push this idea that Gwen is on her own. She's isolated, her friends are really far away, she has no way to contact them, and she's feeling lost and she's feeling angry. And we found that it could be really cool to maybe have her be this really red hot color, while around her, her bandmates and the environment are set in this really cool tone, and you can really feel how disconnected she is from the rest of the scene.
And I love that we were like, the emotionality here, Kat, is she's hot. She's just hot, and you're like, great, and came back, and she's just hot color, and it works because her emotionality is now right on screen for everyone to witness.
Yeah, and her relationship with her dad is also so important in this film. And in all of the scenes that we have with the two of them together, we try to play with ways in which we can show the emotional distance between them and then also find ways to bring them together. So in this scene, Gwen's got more of a cool color palette, and she's coming home to her dad, who's in his element, in his environment with all these warm colors, but none of it is penetrating for her. She still feels really cold, really distant. And we have this moment where, they have a little conversation, she walks into her room, and then now the environment matches her colors. It's all in that cool color palette, and her dad is the one that stands out. He's the one that doesn't belong in Gwen's world. But then at the end of their conversation, we have this really beautiful moment where the two of them embrace and they come together, and we see these watercolors spread out from their hug to form an entirely new sort of vision.
And that hug still literally warms my heart whenever I see it. I've seen it 100,000 times. And still I'm like, that's a really nice hug.
So on this panel here, that was this moment between, spoiler, you guys.
Yeah, wait a minute, has everyone here seen the
Yeah, just in case. Okay, good. So this moment is between George and Gwen, and for us, for the boards, again, it's just that idea of how can we, summarize a moment in one shot. This is him trying to decide what he's going to do after hearing or seeing that Gwen is basically Spider-Gwen. And so this idea of the framing had to be this way of just setting up that scene. But I want you just to keep in mind the eyes and the eye line, which in other words is the way he's not looking to camera, which is super, super important. Now, of course, with the transition and the amazing work for the visual artists, it just emphasizes all those pieces, which is super, super important.
Well, and I think what was great, we make this film, I think, in an unorthodox way. There's a lot of back and forth between story and design. And so when we were looking at the boards, what we were realizing is, we get the sense, all that does matter is his eyes and his body language. Then nothing else matters. And let's remove everything else and represent it purely with that emotionality. No one cares about the set behind him anymore. All Gwen is looking at is the fact that he is turned away from her. And so that's story influencing design.
So as we were talking about before, her eye line is to her father, who she's pleading and hopefully to get have eye contact. But again, trying to get those emotions being very specific. If you only have much time and working within these scenes, it's super important to try to get that. So that was the emphasis. And again, I want to make sure that you guys don't think these are all pretty drawings and this is all done at the same time. It's really many iterations of story And at the point that we get to presentation and preview and for clarity, we make them look pretty. And I'll take the time to do these pieces. But I don't get married to them. So just so you know, it's always trying to push that as a story.
And another great key by art director Dean Gordon, he came up with this idea that if George glanced, out of the corner of his eyes over to his daughter, which he's not, but if he were to catch that glimpse, he can only see her as the masked villain he's been chasing, not the daughter that's in front of him. And so Dean, with his brilliance, just break from tradition, just say, forget it, we're just going to put the mask in the background. Because now the background, again, the set doesn't matter, but our perception of who these characters are does. And that's what's paramount. And I thought that this took what was already a great idea and just boiled it down to its essential needs for storytelling and emotionality.
So in this one here, we try to get the idea of in front of her is her past, and what's behind her is her future. And these kind of ideas and visuals really help because we end up doing that as a master shot for Miles later on in the apartment. Again, spoiler. If you watch, you'll see that he has the portal behind him, but in front of him is the actual barbecue. So it's all done with intent and subconsciously. So again, when you go into relay story, as Patrick is saying to everybody here, we're always trying to find ways to get that very clear idea and be able to implement that, and so that every department can plus it. So again, when you watch this and you rewatch it again, this comes out on Tuesday, can we say
Oh yeah, Tuesday.
Tuesday, and you can
our
frame it.
Our publicists, PR people here want to
That's
make
right.
sure everyone knows.
That's right.
Tuesday, run
Digital,
to your internet,
you go
buy
Amazon,
it.
iTunes, but you'll see that they're almost in the same framing. So again, just to show that how, as you ask like these kind of ideas, we pitch this stuff and we keep trying to find ways to get that clear through line for the story.
And again, this I believe is the final shot here, although it could be a key because we did paint them pretty accurately. Focusing on that emotionality. Let story drive design and let us react to story with a conversation. I encourage everybody here as filmmakers, if you're the designer, your head of story is your compatriot, that is your collaborator. We're working together to tell the story as clearly and get that emotionality across as best we can. So going from Gwen's world to the world of Nueva York. Yeah, this was a favorite of mine. So Rick Leonardi, created the character Spider-Man 2099, and we were absolutely, we loved the character, we loved the emotionality of the character, the design of the character was fantastic, but we wanted to bring something a little more to it. When we're making these design decisions, we're always thinking about the narrative. And whose point of view is the narrative being told by? But of course, our protagonist, Miles. As slick and cool as the Rick Leonardi comics were, from Miles's perspective, although Miguel, I guess, represents this future, what he actually is sort of this, he's like the elder statesman of it all. And so we wanted to represent the future in this idea of the retrofuturism. Miguel is stuck sort of in a past vision of what the future is going to become. And so instead of just riffing from the comic books, we went back and looked at comic books from the era. This fantastic comic book called Space 1999 by the artist John Burns. We love that illustration style of the era. And we asked the artist to use those tools to recreate this world. It's a much more analog style than Miles, who represents the future, today, the digital era. This is an opportunity to lean sort of into the past of what our preconceived visions of the future were. That coupled with a brutalist architecture put Miles actually into this authoritarian spider web that he is going to have to escape. But I'd like to focus here on the world that, not just the world that Miguel inhabits, but his design itself. He is a controlling factor, but needs to be this terrifying beast when he gets riled up. And Kris, I think you can speak to this better than anybody, because he designed him, but also had a big love for the character coming into the project.
Yeah, so Miguel was like a pretty daunting assignment. It was my first assignment on the movie.
Yeah, we like to throw them into the deep.
Yeah, that was like day one. Like, hey, you want to work on this movie? Here's our second.
Fill out your paperwork, right? All right, the major character. Let's go.
But what was really nice about it was that they had a very clear kind of vision for what the character needed to be, and the sort of juxtaposition that every other Spider character, from Miles to Peter to Penny to Gwen, sort of fell into being a Spider, and how kind of their own personhood sort of adapted to that and kind of their moral center. With Miguel, the idea was that he chose to be a Spider. And so everything about him needed to feel intentional, perfectly designed. Nothing needed to be like, oh, I haphazardly put this together. It was like, no, this was my intent. We kind of had like a thing of like, he needed to feel kind of like the Predator, where like everything about his movement and how he ran and how he looked was all with, purposeful intent. And it kind of what sort of worked out and kind of backwards was like, I spent about 15 months on this character, and which is probably the longest I spent on any of the characters in the movie. But like that gave me kind of this nice sort of headspace with him of every aspect of him I poured over. Like, I spent months on just the patterning of the suit, in kind of in the sort of the same way that we kind of wanted Miguel to sort of feel like he did as well. So that every little nook, you have a kind of really nice graphic macro sense of the character, but then you get really up close and there's little tiny minutia patterns all over him. You want to go?
Yeah, sure.
And then so like what was really kind of the moment that kind of clicked was we had a really good script, and we had I think we had Adam Menix at this point. So like there was a lot of I got a lot of sense of his body acting and kind of who he needed to be, and because he was sort of this guy who was holding all this together by himself, he felt that he needed to be really tired all the time. And he just kind of needed to always have, like, every single time, every version of the story of like him meeting Miles or Peter, Miguel is just totally, he's done with the conversation before the conversation starts.
Yeah.
And so he needs to feel fed up with it, and that was kind of our kind of going point of like, he spent so much time putting all this on his shoulders that he just looks exhausted at every sort of second.
The heavy lifting that design often has to do is say the things that the story can't. He can't really just walk out and be like, I'm so tired of dealing with all you spiders all the time. Like, that's not really moving the narrative forward. But in the design and in the performance, we start to understand this guy's not just an asshole. Everyone's personal opinion aside, he's exhausted. He's exhausted. He's been trying to hold this all together forever. He's not just out to get these spiders. He doesn't have a vendetta against Miles. He's fatigued. He's been doing this forever, and he just needs it to work out. And I think these designs and the character designer often, while the storyboards are being done and we're exploring the dialogue of the character, I often find that the character designer is tasked with the very difficult challenge of almost being the first iteration of the acting of that character. And so it's not just about sitting there and figuring out, that T-squared design that we've all seen, but bringing the character to life. Who is this character? How do they deal with anger? How do they deal with fatigue? How do they deal with happiness? These things are all choices that need to be made by the character designer, working with myself and the directors to figure out and get to meet this person for the first time. Because of course, the actors aren't just walking into the room. The actors are right here with the animators developing and becoming these characters.
And what was sort of kind of nice about this page when I got to him was a very big part of it was respecting the original comic, and kind of the thing that I really loved about this character that really set him apart from the other spiders to me was he's dramatic as shit. And like, he gives himself a cape, and he wears a skull, and he slinks in the shadows, and it's like everything about him is so theatrical that like I really wanted to kind of play that up. And at that point I think we're kind of hemming and hawing on the cape, but like the cape is such a great dramatic kind of graphic element that I want to be like, well, this is kind of what we could do with them. And one of those things of like, I think when you're designing that I don't think a lot of people think about is you have to design in a way that you may not be in the room to talk about the design. And so one of the elements I really want to do is like the red glows. And so the best way to do that is then do a drawing in which the red glows. And so anyone can look at it and go, oh, I understand what that intent is, because this is going to have to go down so many rungs of the ladder through the production that I need kind of everyone to sort of get what I'm going for, because I can't talk to every single person. And so you kind of have to over-explain and give the vibe and see everyone kind of like, oh, I'm down for that.
Yeah, when it comes to design in that regard, it's true. We always talk about that. It's like, hey, does this make sense? It's like, well, now that you explain it, it does. Well, you don't get to sit in a movie theater and hit pause, but okay, everybody, here's the thing. And so you get to hit things kind of hard, and that we love that sort of clarity in the design. There's so much happening in this movie. There's so much to be distracted by. Plus, you got your popcorn, soundtracks banging. So we need these things to come across to the audience with such clarity. And I think it really, you drove that forward. Once we get through the character design of it all, we'll model these characters, and then we actually have to bring all that thinking and boil it down to the actual character paint. This one, I believe, was done by Will Coyner, who might be...
I think it's Jake.
Oh, Jake Penning, yeah.
Jake did the blue, and then I did the pattern over the blue.
Got it. A lot of these things went through a lot of
Yeah,
hands.
well,
and-
29 for a long time was Jake.
Yeah,
Jake was
that's
the one I was
right.
talking to.
And so, well, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, what's cool about this, and kind of to go back to the point of like, we kind of kept going back and forth, was it spent a lot of time in character paint, and then you guys had developed the Nuevo York world so much, and you had imbued so much culture into that world, that then, 9 months later, we're like, none of that culture is in the suit.
Yeah.
And so it's like, then it came back to me, and I spent another, 6 months of just like, cool, then how do we imbue the culture of his world into his own suit and like add that new element? And so it's just then about like, doing as much research as I possibly can, because you want to like be respectful of culture and but also want to feel authentic and have it come through and and feel specific as well. And the only way you can really do that is to ask people and do as much research as you can. And so I spent a ton of time just looking at different sort of Mesoamerican patterns and calendars and fabrics and anything I can kind of get an element that just felt kind of really specific that I can kind of work into. And if you look at what the left one was nice is that you don't really see any of it. It still kind of dissolves out and becomes a bold graphic shape. But then you get up close to it and it's like all there. And kind of to add to that idea that Miguel spent, hours just over the minutia of the suit.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to his character as well, that he would labor over every one of those details, but it's also who he is. We can't escape who we all are. I'm still sticking as much graffiti into movies as possible. And we bring who we are to these films, and then when you think of Kris is now Miguel making his own suit. So he has to, it's almost like method acting in a way. He had to become an angry person. He was injecting himself with spider webs. It was terrifying, but the work shows up on screen.
All I had to do was read all the notes and then I was there.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing will get you riled up than halfway through making something, somebody coming by and saying, "We had a brilliant idea."
You want to start over on that? I'm like, what?
Take the afternoon off because this is going to hit you hard. Yeah. I think, Octavio, you speak to this the most, but one of these great sequences in 2099.
Yeah, so the Web of Destiny, I'm trying to figure that stuff out. Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, it is a combination of stuff, but when it comes to story, we're always iterating, and it's very vital to have that. The reference and building the design is one thing, but when we have to do story, we have to kind of figure out new ideas because as it is in the script, a lot of times it kind of lays flat there, so we have to kind of push things as much as possible. So in pitching this, this was one of the first designs that we pitched about how we see all the different spider people. And sometimes you don't have, some of the designs because you have to move at a fast clip, but this ended up going back to the Department of Design to figure out if we're going to use these characters or not. Or we have to see if they're actually approved yet.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other thing. But it was amazing just to kind of figure this stuff out because there wasn't really yet a design for this. There was kind of like some ideas, but we had to kind of figure out the Web of Destiny. So that also had many hands before we even got to the final product. This I hear is a dynamic. So in doing story, and story is, for those who don't know, it's like cinematography. It's a combination of cinematography, acting, everything. And you had to kind of think of the shots. And for me, when we first started this thing, it was trying to figure out where are we going to have the moments between Miles, Miguel, and Peter. Because at one point, at a previous or early stage of this sequence, it was just those three and then Gwen. It wasn't all the spider people. So that just gives you a little bit of a taste of how you had to make really quick changes and then come back to just those shots. So these were just trying to get beats and moments that we could talk about. And then we get to the last one. So this is basically the moment. As you can see, Lila is actually big, but you'll see in the next shot, she's actually small. Why? Because those are choices for creative choices. about how we do these sequences. But again, it's like, it's really pushing these things, and it tells something. But yeah, again, it's always trying to find a way to get and isolate those moments and push as much story as possible. So again, story has a lot of different things that go into it. But yes, with the design, that's like comes first. And we always try to figure out, because you want to put it on a model and all that great stuff, but you're working at a fast clip. So again, I want to frame for the board artists and stuff like that. It's usually rough is because we have to move really fast and we have to knock out things and to make it as emotional as possible. And then we get to this part so you can see what it looks like, the final.
Yeah, and in the end, a lot of these story decisions, you watch those reels over and over again. We don't need a 5'5" Lila walking around. It's not as much fun. It doesn't work with the gags. These ideas that will inform the design are all being worked out at the storyboard stage. And what Octavio was talking about, and for any board artists here, get really comfortable showing your rough work, because that's just you're getting the ideas on screen and we're working through ideas. It's not about making it pretty yet. Don't worry, we'll take care of that. Kat's here, she's gonna make it look great. What we're trying to do is get people to feel, and for the jokes to land, and for the anticipation and the fear to hit, at a visceral, emotional level. One of these things, we looked at the earlier artwork for John Burns, Rick Leonardi, the origins of this character. What we were finding is this world needed more depth. It needed a better understanding of the era in which the artwork was being created. And so we started to go back and look at artists like Sid Mead, John Berkey, and how were they actually making this artwork? Not just what's the artwork that ends up on the wall, but the actual methods in which they're making it, the tools in which they're using. We want to build it just like Miles's world with that DNA, right? From the beginning, that foundational stuff. And that's what we were looking at this stuff for. How many times did you hear me say T square, set square? I actually studied industrial design for a year before dropping out of illustration school. And my industrial design teacher would yell at me every day, T square, set square. These are the rulers that you're using to work as an industrial designer. There's an exacting precision. The era of Sid Mead and all these artists, these people were all taught to be car designers, traffic designers, architects, they're industrial designers. When they became concept artists, they brought all that learning, all those methods and all those tools with them to their new jobs. And so, we looked at all that stuff and brought it into this world. It gave it the real sense of that retrofuturism. We weren't sort of like faking it, but we were going back and making it from the beginning. I think the place where that is like most on display in this film, and the part that I kept calling Kat back, even though she was trying to be on vacation, was for, was for the burst cards. This is an opportunity to sort of show the world at its most basic essentials. It's raw creationism. And so Kat, I have these here if you want to flip.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, if you could go back to the previous slide for a second.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, so a burst card is essentially where we take a really cool action moment in a scene and decide, hey, we want to really punch this up and give it a lot of emphasis. And so for this scene, we have Miguel kind of jumping into the air and landing. He does this really cool pose with his arms where they form this X. And we decided this would be a great point to insert one of these burst cards. And the fun thing about this movie is that when we did these burst cards, we would try to take the existing style of that world and pump it all the way up to like 100%. So on the first film, there were burst cards as well in Miles's world, which is a lot more comic book inspired. And so those moments, you would feel the screen tone dots a lot more, the colors would be really bold, really graphic. And we wanted to try a similar thing in the world of 2099 with his burst cards. We decided to lean really heavily into the references that Patrick was showing that are a lot flatter. They show the hand of the artist more. You can feel the medium and the texture of the paint and the markers and the paper that was used. And to just walk you guys through what that looks like, when working on these, I would first receive some shots, just single frames, just showing the general posing of the characters and the layout of the scene. And then on top of these shots, I would start basically redrawing the entire frame, but trying to work in this really specific look. And for this style, we would start with photo blue pencil, because you kind of want to get in the head. What if I was a concept artist in the 70s? What tools would I have on hand? What would I be using to draw this? Well, you would probably sketch it out first. And then once your sketch is done, you would go on top with some black ink. You would ink out the form, and then you would start to add the marker color and the paint on top. And then from there, I would start developing the background elements as well, getting in some of that marker streaking and drafting lines too. These drafting lines, again, right, the whole T-square thing, making sure you plot out, if you were doing this by hand, you didn't have Photoshop, you didn't have computers, you would really have to use a ruler and plot all of this stuff out. And finally, when everything all comes together, it looks something like this. And we would do maybe 4 or 5 frames of these per burst card. And often there would also be a color change as well, so that you can feel that as it's bursting on screen, there might be like a flash of color. Because, it goes by so fast. I think it's literally 0.000, it's like a fraction of a second that you see it on screen, but it's more of an emotional thing, even if you can't specifically see all the little details. And just a fun little detail to add as well is in the corner of this specific shot, I kind of just scribbled this in, and it's meant to be a reference to the specific marker colors that an artist might have used in the 70s if they were drawing this. So yeah, that's burst cards.
And I love that I don't even think, I don't remember how I stumbled on it. Maybe you did tell me, but we got in trouble for using the real marker color pens.
Yeah.
Because those are, somebody owns those colors. And so you just put a little nod to myself, which I'm so grateful for. I am Crimson Red POK, and then Imperial Violet Dean Gordon, which is a nice, cute little thing. I think, we encourage all the artists to have fun and give nods, and there's lots of shout outs from one artist to another all over this film. And yeah, that's how you end up with that. So all that work for 4 frames, but it hits, and it's gorgeous, and it gets through the emotionality and the intention, as well as being, this extra moment where you can celebrate the sort of the homage that we're making to the great art form, these shoulders that we're standing on. All right, another one of the challenges of going across the Spider-Verse, of course, is you have to, and going into Spider Society, is that you have to design a lot. How many? A lot of spiders.
Somewhere between 170 and 200. So it's funny. So after I'd done, a bunch of what we call the named spiders, and those were the ones that we wanted to make sure we highlighted in the movie, and that were from comics. We just wanted to get as many of them as we were legally allowed to put in. We still had sort of a problem that it didn't feel robust enough in the watch. We call it the Watchtower Society.
It's Spider Society now.
We have so many production names for things. I don't know what anything's called anymore.
Yeah.
And then they were we want to have an additional 100 spiders to just make up. And so that was kind of a very nice challenge for me, because it was both just an attempt to kind of be creatively free and to sort of do whatever I wanted. And that provides its own challenges, because to design 101 thing, you kind of have to just sort of go as far out there as possible. But it was also really kind of a means to include a lot of things that would not normally, the problem with developing or translating a lot of characters from the comics is 98% of them are Peter Parkers. And that gets kind of repetitive, especially in a movie in which, inclusion and diversity is a very big deal in terms of the plot. That then if you go to a society in which they're all white dudes, it kind of,
it would be terrifying.
Yeah, it doesn't feel doesn't feel great. And there was, and I remember, I don't know if anyone caught this, but there was a moment in which two of our producers just sort of like looked at me, and two of the women in the room were like, "Can you make sure there's women?" And I was like, "I got you." So
Yeah.
intentionally, like from then on, even including name spiders, I would do a 50-50 split down the line. I would change Peters into women. I would then, and as I'm doing the sort of the generics that I call them, I would make sure, you know, half of them are women, and even then it's like, it's not even really 50-50, because I would, you know, part of the intent is that I'm kind of going like, not that anyone can really notice, but it's like, these are non-binary, these are trans, these are what have you, because I just want to fill up the room. You know, the whole anyone can wear a mask, it's kind of chicken shit if we don't then show that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not on it's not on the audience to do the work for us. We need to actually show, you know, sort of a diverse kind of range of people. And so, like, on our side, you know, even though I kind of make it really blunt with, top left, I made it sort of really blunt there. But not everyone, you know, you can kind of look at any of them and go, that I want that one to be me. And that's sort of the intent, is that, like, if anyone can be, then anyone should be able to. So it became kind of this sort of fun thing of adding as much sort of range as possible. And you know, even then, I'm kind of getting a little mentally fried. So a lot of these are also like based on friends of mine. And I would, you know, which is really nice for like just authentic body diversity. But then like, I would just ask people for like their favorite colors. And I would just, because then it would just be combinations in which I wouldn't think of. Like, there was one like ochre and pink, which I never would have thought of those two, but then like that makes a really cool kind of design. And so I did I did 100 of these, and most of them made it through. But then like, so just hit next on this, Patrick.
Yeah, and I just want to say, you know, what I loved about when we were just like, we were kind of painstakingly art directing you through lots of spiders, and then eventually it was sort of like, the story I've heard about, like Indiana Jones with the rats under the city, they were just like, we need more rats. We need more.
Yeah.
We just got back from set. We're going to need a lot more rats. And they started breeding rats, and they just had like thousands of rats. And it's like, anytime we put 50 spiders in a room, we're like, oh boy, we're going to need like 500 spiders. But then you taking the assignment and attaching everything you just said, the ethos of this film and this trilogy eventually, is that we celebrate the differences. When we look at the differences in comic books, we're celebrating the differences between those comic books. And we don't have to look hard to see these differences. You know, we talk about inclusion, but what we did is we just included all the people we see in our daily lives. And that's just who and what these films truly are. But we did have some cool specifics.
Yeah. So then the other kind of side of it was then like, we wanted to include characters from the comics. And kind of what was really fun about that is then with every character we had sort of this, how can we holistically punch this up? And like, if, you know, because a lot of these designs were sort of done on the page and it just needed to work for the moment. But it's like, okay, but let's take a step back. Let's really think about like, you know, we want to do a cowboy Spider-Man, but like, what does that mean? You know, what can that mean? So it's like, I kind of, you know, this was one of the ones that I spent a long time on just because like cowboys are such a wide net. And, you know, I was doing a bunch of cowgirls, and we're trying, you know, one of the things I really wanted to do with a lot of these characters is like, what kind of like authentic route can I get to? And so one of the ideas that like really worked for me with cowboys was like, we've seen a lot of kind of American Western cowboys, a lot of white dudes. And I was like, what if we kind of, you know, with given the area and kind of the culture, just made it Mexican. It doesn't need to be like a big thing, but just make Mexican cowboys. Mm-hmm. And so I made, like, at one point we had an entire posse of Mexican cowboys and cowgirls.
There's a few drawings where we were like, oh man, we only have time for one of these, but I want to watch that TV show with this posse.
I mean, I think you even boarded a gag in which like Miles faces off against like 6 bandits.
Yeah.
just to kind of like have all these cowboys in there, but it's like, you know, cowboys are something so culturally specific to America and kind of like what America became, what America was, that you wanted to add all of this sort of, you know, inherent culture to it. But then also we want to think about render style, and with a lot of these other characters that like, it's not always obvious, but sometimes it is. And with this, we were looking at kind of old Western comics, especially the ones done by Mobius and Blueberry. So with this one, I think why like this drawing I think really kind of works well is that like this was also me doing a inking study of what Mobius was doing on that book to kind of set forth like what that style is, because you know Westerns have a lot of looks, and I think we think of a lot of Westerns in terms of film, but that doesn't really work for what we're doing. So because we had this very clear printed medium visual look, that was like, trying my best to kind of land on that.
And nailed it.
And then this was another one that I don't think he made it in, but what was a really fun, this was a fun gag from like the director really wanted to do a zombie Spider-Man. But what was really interesting about this, because one of the things that will always eventually run its, pop its head up is budget. And so what was nice about this design, it was like an interesting challenge, is then I had to use the dead Peter from Into the Spider-Verse as like the base, because all of those tears are already modeled. And so it just like, then like I'm just translating that model into a new idea. The only thing I really did was open up the mouth. But apart from that, it's like that would have just been like the exact same model. And I'm like, that's kind of like you don't really think about that as like a design, like, hurdle. But sometimes, with one of the characters, I think it was Spider-Man 2211 with the 4 arms, was like, can we build him out of other pieces just to kind of limit the budget on it? This one's Patrick.
Yeah. So, hey, the great thing about the collaborative medium of filmmaking is you fill in the holes that you have, that we each individually have. I don't know everything there is to know about Spider-Man, so we get a Kris, Anka, and he knows everything there is to know about Spider-Man, and will fill in all the gaps and tell us all this stuff. Now, what I do know about is Canada and hockey. Now, we got in trouble, including a spider that shall go unnamed, and we're no longer allowed to include them in the film, and that'll be the last we talk about that. But as a way to sort of rub the, to throw a little snow, I guess I'll say,
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Oh, I'll tell you later. This is how this came up. Phil Lord turned to me and was like, well, then we need a spider that's really going to, say something to these creators and let them know. And I said, well, Spider Canada, and we got a sticker in a hockey jersey. This is the Summit Series 72 jersey where Canada single-handedly beat the Soviet Republic. And I don't just mean in hockey. I mean, we ended the Cold War by beating them in hockey. But, we wanted to always diversity, inclusion, and celebrate our heroes. And so we made her a Spider Woman based, off of the fantastic female hockey players whose names are escaping from me right now. My wife is glaring at me because who am I thinking? Kaylee Wakenheiser. I got the whole presentation in my head except for that. And it was just perfect. And then I gave Kris a reference sheet, and he just nailed it.
Yeah. And it's sometimes it's nice because it's like having a really concise kind of vision for a character, and it's just like, cool, I gotta just nail what you want. And sometimes it's really kind of a nice breath of fresh air compared to like the Cowboys, where it's like, do whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay.
And much to the chagrin of Phil Lord eventually, because 80% of the crew is in Canada, the animators just start sticking her in every single shot. There's like one-off character was just now everywhere, just like lurking in the background, hanging out, because we were all so proud. Canadians, we know every Canadian, and we're so proudly Canadian, and so we just started sticking her absolutely everywhere. And eventually he was like, all right, I love you, and I love the character. She can't, if we're looking that way and she's on camera, we can't be looking that way and she's also on camera.
I mean, we could have just made a whole team.
Yeah. Oh. We'll talk about that.
Yeah. So this one was a fun one for me as well because, Penny Parker was created by Gerard Way and Jake White, and Jake White's a friend of mine. And so it was actually kind of nice to be able to take what Jake's original design was and go, okay, well, let's do it good.
Burn.
And I think it's kind of interesting because then it's like Jake, a very unapologetic anime fan, and very much, the original design is very much based on an Eva. What's cool about that in the comics doesn't necessarily work when there's legal involved. And so part of the kind of thing is like, how do I keep the essence of that design, but also just move it enough that it's not one-to-one an Eva anymore, but it still kind of feels in the same part of like 80s anime. So, I don't always love designing mechs, but like when there's like a fun kind of challenge with it, it's, it can be a kind of a really kind of nice assignment. And so it was really nice to like work on like a buddy's design and go, Like let me just kind of like holistically see what I can do, because I know like we're gonna be able to build this whole thing.
Yeah.
But this design was really interesting. This was the second drawing I did, and then just no one ever said no.
Yeah.
And then like a year later, the model was done, and I was like, what? Like I didn't know we finished that. So,
Yeah. One of the things that isn't often talked about, and we try to do a better job as leads, is celebrate the wins. Because so often there's so much to do. When you see a piece of artwork that just hit, it's like, okay, great, let's see. Okay, we're moving on. And then I'll give you 1,000 notes about the one that did.
Yeah.
And barely a pat on the back for the win. So
Yeah, I mean, I was like, hey, what happened to the design? I need to go back to it, and they're like, oh no, it's finished.
it's in the movie.
I was like, what?
It's in the movie. It looks great. Sorry, no one told you.
Yeah. And this was another really kind of fun one. You know, with all these, we got to include kind of the newer spiders, and kind of taking sort of like, you know, what was really nice about in the last 10 years is there's definitely been a push in the comics to like add more kind of new and diverse spiders in the comics. So it's like any opportunity we could have to like build them up or at given points. I think she had already been written kind of to have a large role in the movie.
Yeah.
So I was like, cool. Then we can really like let's really get in there and figure her out and kind of spend a lot of time kind of how do we show a digital spider character, especially when you have Miguel, who has a digital suit, and you have Lila, who is a digital person. And it was like, how do we find a different way
Yeah.
to kind of show that same idea, but in kind of a new sort of look? So she was kind of a really cool, fun, and especially, you know, we don't get to do a lot of the young spiders anymore. A lot of the main characters kind of came from the last movie. So she was one of the few of like, ooh, I got to do like a new kind of youthful main character. Especially because I didn't work on Punk or India, much to my like both joy to watch and jealousy because they're so cool. Nothing pissed me off more than looking at Jesus' Punk drawings. I was like, those are the greatest things in the world. I could never have done that, but I wish I could have.
Everybody gets upset looking at Jesus.
Every pitch of Jesus is just like, all the designers just camera off, just like, oh, come on.
The hardest, arguably the hardest part about being a production designer is, and it's the joy as well, is you assemble this unbelievable team of incredible artists. And then every morning as I'm walking into Viz Dev reviews, I'm like, okay, how am I going to tell my favorite artist in the world that I have notes? And how do I even find those notes? How do I make this better, even though it's already so incredible?
The best was like, Jesus would be like, I don't know, here's a sketch.
Yeah.
And we're like, what are you talking about? And he's like, I don't know,
I'm not really feeling any of these, and everybody's there just like, you see cameras getting turned off because people are crying.
And to kind of go with more of that kind of like, you know, very intentional diversity sort of attention was, you know, Phil Lord came to us with like, there's a new spider in the comics that's going to get a bigger thing called Sun Spider, which was also addedly fun because I was aware of Sun Spider as a spider sona that a fan made after the last movie came out. They then won a contest at Marvel to then make their sona canon. So then it became like this cool thing of putting this fan's character into the movie now. And what was really kind of fun, because I really wanted to like, it was with everything, it's like you want to do as much research as possible. So I was like stalking Twitter, trying to like find like any reference that Dane would make to the character and kind of talk about like the compression pants or what kind of wheelchair or what kind of all these things. And like thankfully at one point I had to do a cover for Marvel with Sun Spider on it. So I got to kind of like under the radar talk to them about it.
Yeah.
And I never mentioned the movie. Yeah. But I was able to tell like, okay, what were you thinking with all these things? And at one point with the character, I thought it'd be cool, like, what if we included Dane's actual wheelchair? Because this character, I can't remember what the disability is called.
She's paraplegic, right?
It's a specific one where it's like it's a weakness of the joints. It's something, I can't remember what it's called. Sorry. And so I was like, what if I put their wheelchair as Sun Spider's wheelchair? That'd be really fun. And I got a great note from Phil being like, that's cool, but like, can we make it even cooler? And I was like, well, the only thing cooler than, because I was thinking also about like, you know, when you're character designing, you're also, you know, you were designing the character. So I'm trying to think about like actual purpose in animation, and this character, you know, sits in the wheelchair to rest and to get off their knees, but they can swing and move around normal with the crutches. But I was like, I don't want to just leave the wheelchair behind. It's really annoying, especially for animation, it's just kind of boring. I was like, what if we made the wheelchair into a mech that can transform and follow them? And that way it's always there and it's always thing. And so it's this really kind of cool opportunity of like you take the wheelchair and you plus it into something really cool that then can have its own character, and you kind of always kind of like find those opportunities to kind of add little things to it. You know, and kind of in a smaller sense, there's this, you know, the Mangaverse spider, which was like one of my favorite, you know, there was like the second spider that was like, it has to be in the movie. I was like, Spider-Man Unlimited, and then Mangaverse spider was like, has to be in the movie. But it was just like, he just wore a shirt, and I was like, he's just a little bit cooler, but just a little addition of adding a gi, and like, that's it. And like, that's all we had to do, and we turned like this kind of like floating backpack into a real backpack. And, you know, and even in modeling, I had to like really like, how does this backpack work? How do stitches work? Like, you have to really think about all those things in sort of a practical sense, but also never lose sort of the graphicness of these designs. And an unfortunate character, because I think it was just way too much money to make. But one of my favorite designs that I got to do was this just giant monstrosity, and I thought it'd be a really fun gag if he was the cook, because we had the cafeteria, yeah, in the movie for sure, and I was like, who better run the cafeteria than the person with 6 arms? And I even wanted to like hit the joke really on the head and like make it like the same voice actor as Bob's Burgers. Yeah. And just really hit it, and he's just really tired of doing this job. You know, but even with this, it's like I did a separate thing. Like I designed all those props, because you need to also like distinguish that. Like, you don't want to just like show the modelers a photo, because it's like, well, that is real. It is kind of visually less interesting than to really sort of play up the sort of props and kind of the design of the props. One character that did make it in, though, that was very, very popular, is the cat, which is based on one of my friend's cats, who is just a big, fat, mean cat. But no one needs to know that, and we got to kind of, because Spider Cat was a character in the comics, and there's sort of this like anthropomorphic kind of white cat, and you know, to that thing of, can we ground this at all? So like we did versions of like an anthropomorphic cat, but then we also did versions of like just a fat, real cat. And like that just played better, was visually more interesting, was more fun. And then, you know, that kind of made it into a movie and kind of stole the show.
Yeah, and it's that removing and going back to the source, that's the celebrating the differences. What's different about this character is it's a cat.
Yeah. My friends sent me photos of their cat, and I would just pose it based on the photos, like this is real cat.
Yeah, we got enough spiders walking around.
Yeah.
And let's just get a cat and stick it in a suit.
Yeah.
Going on to our next world. This one is, as I've said, it's like favorite in my heart. This one was super close to me because of my connection on making the first film. This is a return to a world that is a reflection of the first film and a reflection of where Miles is from. How are we going to represent this world that is so familiar to Miles, but through the lens of the unfamiliar, the out of place? Something is amiss here. And the idea was to take away those Ben-Day dots and start replacing them with things that are more crudely amassed by the artist. It's going to be spray paint. It's going to be splatters. Instead of these nice, colorful shadows, it's going to have this dramatic darkness that's just, I'm just going to fill it in with ink and then throw the colors underneath. And we're making this aggressive world because from Miles' point of view, of course, this is what the emotionality, the feelings he's getting from this world. It became a labor of love because I actually had to hand ink pretty much every single shot in the interrogation scene several times as the story changes, new shots pop up. We really, really wanted to overly art direct and nail down this gritty, aggressive look. And so that, we talked about doing burst cards, hand drawing every frame. Here we were hand inking every shot, and then the incredible geniuses at Sony Pictures Imageworks would then be mapping some of those on as textures. Some of those would be generated by lighting. Anything we could do to never make it feel like it's just a comic book just a comic book on screen, but a comic book that comes to life.
Yeah, and then for this was a pitch that we put together as we try to translate as much as possible how we were going to do like panelization, which is one of the things that was in the movie. This was when he enters, again, spoiler. Yes.
Aaron's in this?
Yeah, Aaron's.
Uncle Aaron?
So this was a pitch where, to do a recap, just in case you guys had not known about what happened, I put this together for the directors, and it was one of those things where it felt a little bit too much, but again, it's like you just want to get that across and see how that pitch works. But there is some kind of iteration that's in the movie, which is a little bit slightly different. But again, this just gives you an idea of how we kind of work through these shots.
Yeah, that's a really important thing, is we're trying things out constantly. The story is trying things out constantly and getting it up on screen, and we're looking at it as a crew and eventually screening it to a test audience to see, do people even remember, like when Uncle Aaron walks in, is everybody just gonna be like, wait, who's that dude? Or are people like, oh my God, it's Uncle Aaron, no more explanation needed. These are ideas you can only get answers to by doing the work and putting it up on screen. When it came to developing the style of this world, this darker, grittier, high contrast world, we, of course, as Phil calls me and always reminds me, go back to the comic books. And the first idea was to look at the works of Frank Miller. They're so dramatic. They're so dramatic, but they're so intentional in the way that they're doing things, and yet there's a looseness, there's an expressiveness, even in the way the ink is being put into place. Another artist that was really an influence for me for their graphic design breakdown was Kris, and of course the great, Jean-Paul Leon. His use of positive and negative space became a guiding light for myself and the lighting team. We would just turn over black and white drawings, and I turn over all these references to the lighting artists so they can get a sense of not just where we are, but where we were coming from. And then, of course, an absolute favorite, Sean Gordon Murphy. This is sort of rage put on the page in a lot of ways. The gritty, direct, confident application. I watched videos of him inking, and he would just be like smudging ink and putting fingerprints. So I did the same. I stole that from him. My fingerprints are literally on the film, and just loving all this detail. Similar to Gwen's world, and we did this for every world, I would then make like a package of tools. These are the guidelines of how we're going to express this world on screen. So the heavy hatching instead of the hand style hatching, with a rusty nib splattering ink all over the place, instead of that perfect precision hatching we would see in Miles's world. The spray paint instead of the Bend-Aid dots. Ink that's just being liberally thrown, and of course my fingerprints. Just like any of the worlds, when it comes to set design, we always start with sketches and looking at what the story needs are, working with the story artist, and we'll build I tend to like to build these little 3D mock-ups and speak with the directors and the story artists. Is this the space that's going to work? Do you need a door there? Because I would love to know if you need a door over there now, not 9 months from now. Originally the design of this, the kitchen was just this tiny little kitchenette, and then there was going to be a huge fight in the kitchen, right? And it was like, well, we need a much bigger kitchen. And then we didn't need a bigger kitchen anymore. And so it's always changing, and these 3D models are great because it allows the directors and the story artists, I can just hand these over to them and they can start visualizing the space. Once we land on one of those, we'll start taking it down the pipeline. And what I would do right away is approach it like the comic book artist. I would ink these just like comic book panels, not full paintings yet, but really just thinking about how are we going to divide the space, a la Jean-Paul Leon, with that positive, negative space, bring those Sean Gordon Murphy references in, that aggressiveness, that grittiness, before even thinking about the coloring. Then bringing that color in to be a subliminal message as to whose house is this? Where are we? The idea was, it sounds smart now, but it took a while to get there because you're sitting there painting, kind of smashing your head against the wall, and then realize, I'm in the Prowler's house. This needs to be Prowler colors. And so all that thinking happening to bring this world together. And just a couple of these shots. So this is an example of actually getting the shot back from ImageWorks after story has done their work, layout has done their work, and it comes back to me to then hand ink on top and make a final color key, and then you can see how that translates into the actual shot. One for one. And I think that's something we did on this film, even on the first film, but a better job here was just staying so true to the original artist's intention once we found what we really loved. And just one more example of that. And of course, this gritty, what we would call a render script, that's the look of the world, that is great for how we're going to handle the final image on screen, but that needs to also be paralleled within the character design itself.
Yeah, so this was kind of the first version of who Miles G. I'm gonna probably slip up and call him Wiles. That's what we called him internally for 3 years.
So for like, we were sitting in a meeting room like 4 years ago, and they're like, okay, so Miles goes to Miles, and then Miles, and it was like, we got to straighten this out. And so we ended up just calling him, you know, you got your Mario and you got your Wario. You got your Miles, you got your Wiles.
Yeah. I didn't know he was called Miles G until I was doing like the behind the scenes interviews. I was like, we called him something else, so I'm probably gonna slip up. So this was the original version of Wiles. This is what was really cool about this design was that it was a combination between me and Evening Montero, apologies, and it was kind of trying to find that like homemade sort of character. I don't know what we can call him, but we wanted him to feel like this was a capable person who didn't have spider powers but could still do all of the spider things, and sort of with an uncle who was an engineer who could make him all these things. And you know how I said before that Miguel was the longest, it took me 15 months? That's actually a lie. It is Wiles. I spent 2.5 years on Wiles. Because then after we kind of landed this version, which took like a year, we came back. Someone brilliantly in the story department was like, let's throw out that whole character. Let's make him the Prowler now. And so I had to start all over from scratch. But we had a lot of that like groundwork that was in that previous suit that we really liked. We really liked the vibe of that. And how can we keep that, but then imbue sort of the Prowler iconography and silhouette? And so this is one of the more like tamer versions of the suit, of like all of the sort of mechanics. At this point, we had given him like a full mechanical mask, because there was a board by Winton that like the mask would open up, we do the big reveal, and every director just loved that so much that like how do we engineer a mask that can open in this world? So everything felt, all of the tech feels really brutal and kind of like built by a hammer. Like, Aaron's not really making things that look pretty, they're functional. But we still wanted to give like a bit more kind of like cool and style to it. And what I really wanted to play with was making sure we got that silhouette. And if you remember, Aaron's Prowler has that cape, and like, how do we solve the cape problem with a character who doesn't have one? And I had this idea of like putting the jacket around his hips, and that gives you kind of this really graphic sort of flow that can kind of graphically break into those points. In animation, you can do whatever you want, so it didn't have to sort of follow any sort of physics, but we can make that kind of point. What was really nice about this point is that most of it had been boarded, and so I knew how we would intro Wiles, and so I was trying to like one for one that shot of like, how can we play that, and how do I design for that, because you don't want it to feel too cluttered, but you also want that to read, and so having that kind of already there pose was really kind of, I think it ended up actually changing, but for what I need to do, it helped out. This is kind of another one kind of getting there. Really kind of hitting that vibe of like, this feels like a really cool, youthful kid, but also has that like Prowler thing. And then, again, what was really nice about this character for me was it was going back and forth between me and Evening, and where sort of Evening stops and I start is kind of a blend. And so Evening came back at this point, took a pass, and then we kind of ended up here of like me, this is my riff on Evening's riff of my riff. Right? And kind of got us to our sort of final look, except for the mask that got trees. But like the suit itself was kind of like, a really cool mix between me and Evening, and it kind of hits that whole thing of, this is a fun, youthful, exciting character. It feels like Miles but Prowler, and so I think it's probably my favorite design of the whole movie, quite frankly.
Yeah. Iconic.
Yeah.
In a story as vast as Spider-Verse, you've heard us talk about all these challenges, and essentially we had to create like several, I think it was like 6 different movies all in one. But that's what the story required. We traveled from a watercolor world to a graphic, stylized, slick, modern comic book, from retro, obscure printing processes that we found in the, from 1950s Indian comic books, to zine-style punk posters that are Xeroxed together, glued back together, and that just have encapsulate that punk era, to the world of the industrial designer, and finally, a dark, aggressive reflection of Miles' own world. You know, we used every trick in the book to tell this story the way that it needs to be told. And so I think our challenge to all the filmmakers in this room, as everyone goes forward, is to ask the question, how will you tell your story? Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. How much time do we have before the book signing? We have 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to ask one question and open the mic to you guys all because you have much better questions, I'm sure. Tell us, thank you again. That was awesome. We should do a whole book with all the characters that didn't make the movie and all the sets. Can you tell us, each one of you, your favorite scene and character? They could have made it in the movie or they couldn't have made it in the movie. Just quickly.
My favorite scene did make it into the movie, and it's just what I was talking about. That final standoff between Miles and Miles was just an opportunity to art direct the hell out of something. And I love the characters. I love what it offers and asks of the next films. And that's why I just had so much fun building that world, and sort of, it's small enough that I was able to almost control every detail.
I think for me, I'm proudest of everything I got to do on Gwen's world. She's my favorite character in the film. And I was also kind of like an angsty emo kid, you know, when I was in high school. So I just, you know, I feel that kinship with her. But getting to play with the colors in her world and how, you know, how emotional they are and also how far beyond reality they are was really fun for me.
For me, I would say Miles, and also because being Boricua, Afro-Latino, is a big thing for me. So that, and then I have two sequences, we'll make it really quick. One is Miles and Rio. That was one of those things that I actually helped to time and put together for that moment, and the boards with Max Perkins, who was one of the story artists on it, in my team. And also the one we were just talking about, which is the portal in the apartment, was another scene that is just like, it was actually a bigger scene, and we got it to get to be more personal about his journey and making that choice to go into the portal.
I think for me, it's probably the Wiles and Miles kind of first intro and everything with Aaron. You know, I think like along with Patrick, like I probably spent a lot of time, like I think all the characters in 42 were done by me. So I kind of felt like a really sort of like, this was my little tiny pocket. Because I got to design the Aaron, I got to design the Rio, and I got to design the Wiles. And so like, kind of seeing all of that culminate together and like, oh shit, it's real. It was kind of like, you know, pretty cool moment.
Very nice. You know, we're having a very strange summer. You know, that some movies are doing really well at the box office. Your movie, of course. And then we have, you know, the whole talk of AI and what's going to happen to the artists. How do you all feel about where we are in animation in the crazy summer of 23?
If I could speak on this, I am really proud of this film, and I think one of the things I'm proudest of is that there's no way this movie could have been AI generated. You know, I think specifically on like the art side, you know, the stuff that Patrick and I were showing with the burst cards and the inking that he did on Earth 42, that was all made by hand. It was all human drawn. The attention to detail is also something that I feel like it really requires that touch of a human artist. And of course the story, the emotional moments, all of that makes this movie what it is. It comes from real human beings. There's no way you could just, you know, press some buttons, beep boop, and it comes out like that. There's just no way.
And I think to add to that, like, what are we trying to speed it all up for? What are we trying to take away, and what are we trying to eliminate? I make these movies, I hand ink these frames, I work with these artists because I love doing it. More so than the film at the end, what I think we can all agree on is we enjoy the process of making films. And I would hate the idea of that ever not existing, because it's It's a beautiful collaboration. You get to know people, you get to know a lot about yourself. And if we're just plugging things into the machine and it spits it back out, where's our opportunity for growth as human beings and storytellers, and our opportunity to come together? You mentioned box office. Animation is back, baby. We're killing it.
All right, how many people in this room want to get a job in animation or have a job in animation? All right, well, I guess everyone probably wants to know, give them some tips on getting jobs in the animation business, everybody.
I'll go for design, and then Octavio, you can go for story. For me, as a designer, what I look for is your taste and your individuality. Everybody's good at drawing and painting at a certain level. All the portfolios look fantastic. But what I'm looking for are unique individuals that are going to bring a unique perspective. We got 1,000 people, we'll polish it and make it look great eventually. What I'm looking for are great ideas. And I think that only comes from you bringing yourself, the life that you've lived, your personal choices and preferences, and putting that into your art and saying, this is me. And then when a production designer like myself sees that, it says, oh, then I want you to be a part of this film, not just to make artwork for this film.
So yeah, for story as a storyteller and filmmaker, it's one of those things where it's like, yes, all the things that Patrick is talking about, but it's like your film voice. The tendency is that you'll do like standard work and like panels and stories and do the essentials of life drawing, and all that stuff is great. But I'm looking for the stuff that is vulnerable, the things that are uncomfortable. And anything, as when you're telling stories, it's like this thing, like an art gallery, and the artist puts up their heart. That's what needs to be in your portfolio. I know that sounds very complicated, I guess, but the word is that if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then you're not doing it. And we know. And especially in story, because as a filmmaker and a storyteller, it's like we're looking for those things that are unique to your film voice. So for me in a portfolio, that's what I'm looking for. It just has to feel like it's coming from you.
Kind of sum it up, the best piece of advice I ever got in college was, especially in terms of like designing, was like, don't try to learn, like don't try to be like another artist because they already exist and they already have the job, so why would they hire you? Because what you would be doing is what they could do 3 years ago. So find like your own way to do it, because that's what you're going to bring to the table, is something that that person can't do. So find your own, voice.
I guess now we open the room to questions from the audience. Don't feel shy. Right there. First person here.
So this is related to stories. So I think I'm just curious what the team dynamic is between stories, because you get to see the individual scenes. So I'm curious how you choose to assign certain scenes, assign different characters to different artists, and how that is another.
Wow, that's a great question.
Did we all hear that? Do we need to repeat it, or did you all hear it? Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat it?
I can repeat the question. So how do you go about assigning sequences and moments to artists, story artists? And that's a great question. So a lot of times in casting and working with the team, we find those who have the comedy chops or the action chops to do things. But for me, I actually do the opposite. I like to take you out of your comfort zone. So a lot of times if you're doing just the gag stuff, I'll push you onto action. But the thing is, for me, it's like I can get you to F. I'm only expecting you to B. So for my thing, it's just to kind of push you and make you more versatile as a story artist, because that's what you need to be. You don't want to get pigeonholed, and that's one of the things about the industry that could happen, is that you're just specifically that one thing. And if you haven't noticed in animation, like for myself, I worked as head of story, but I was a director. I'm a director again on some other projects. It doesn't really matter the titles. It's really about pushing your journey as an artist. I would say like that's the way I would go about it. But I always gave that disclaimer too when I worked with the team. I don't know if there's any other story artists, but no, Max knows that.
And you know, that goes for a lot of aspects of it. You know, Kat came to the film, and I kept giving her design assignments. And one day she got the courage up to talk to the boss and say, you know, I'm not a designer. And I said, oh, well, you're going to be one pretty soon. And became one of the best designers on the film, and one I hope to work with forever. And I think, and why I bring that up is when you're working for Octavio and he puts you on a scene that makes you very uncomfortable, trust in the leadership that has put you on that assignment, because they know that you're ready for it. And that's why you're there, is because you're supposed to do it.
Yeah, maybe just to clarify on that, because I know Patrick's explaining, but for when I say uncomfortable, it's because I feel that there is resistance and progression. You guys are all here to be artists, and you want to be the best. And the best is who you are going to be. And that's my job, is to actually push you to the next level. That's what you want. So when I say uncomfortable, it's only to benefit you guys to get where you need to go. And I wouldn't put you in any place that you wouldn't want to, but also you gotta push yourselves out of your comfort zone. It's the idea of you get the bag of tricks. That doesn't help you. And I'm not, as a mentor, as a creative leadership, or as a director, I'm not doing you any favors by doing that. So that's what I mean by that.
100%.
Yeah.
I had a question. While watching the movie, we noticed that with Spot and both with Miguel, we can see a lot of like the rough line guidelines for when you're making sketches and stuff. Part of us were wondering, well, my friend and I, she's not here, rest in peace, sorry. She didn't get to, no, she's not dead.
The dramatic arc there was incredible.
The twist.
So I know that you mentioned the first part of it was to emphasize like grittiness and stuff. Was that all mainly that, or was it also like the characters becoming a little engaged? Because with the Miguel scene and him chasing after Miles, you see a lot of those like sketch guidelines, and then you also see it again when the Spot starts to unravel too. I was wondering, was that story based, or was it just kind of the first part of it?
We want the design to help tell the story, and so there's sort of two separate answers there. Although they share similar principles, I mean, line and drawing, you know, these are universal principles of comic books. For Miguel, we wanted to show this underlying structure that he firmly believes in. There's a rigid way to do things, and so that industrial design stylization is about an exacting and a structure that he firmly believes in. As he progresses and we see that come more to the forefront, it was about him sort of doubling down on who he is. I am this structured being. I will not break from my structure. For the Spot, which we didn't really get a chance to talk about today, he represents the antithesis of Miles. Miles lives in this beautiful, rich, colorful world with attention to detail, and it's clean and it's slick and it's beautiful. The Spot is the opposite of all of that. He's the undoing of that world. And so what we wanted was, he has all this comic book language in him, but it's really being reduced down to its bare essentials in the beginning. He is white paper with pencil lines and ink, and that is it. As he progresses into what, we Spot 2.0, all that comic book that he's been absorbing and amassing and disrupting throughout the film is now sort of at his whim, and he's going to use it to wipe the slate clean in so many ways and return what the Spiderverse to its bare essentials, that white paper with ink on top.
Your friend?
Back from the dead.
I had that. It was really hard, and I think that's understating it, honestly. But I think even with kind of the emotional difficulties of going through this, in the end, what I discovered was that imposter syndrome is never going to go away. So it's best to kind of accept it and sort of learn to live with it and then move past it. Where I think previously to this, I'd been working on other animation projects in TV. And I remember when I had started on those projects, I had imposter syndrome of being like, hey, I'm a student. I don't know how to do anything. I'm coming onto this TV show with these artists that I really admire and I respect. And maybe I feel imposter syndrome now, but I'm sure in a few years as I continue improving, that's gonna get better and it's gonna go away. And I discovered that's not the case. It's like with every new thing that I started on, I would always question and doubt myself when I came on and ask, can I really do this? Is this really something that's for me? And I think that trying to conquer that and just realize, that's not gonna go away. It's okay sometimes to feel like things are hard and that you still have a lot to learn, and to just kind of embrace that and keep going.
I think kind of like something that clicked for me was when I noticed that no one knows what they're doing. If you look at this movie, there's no one on this movie who was like, oh no, I know exactly what to do on this scene, on any moment. We talked about Jesus, and Jesus did the most brilliant character designs, but Jesus would downplay everything he'd ever done. And so it's like to him, he was like, whatever, but to us, it's like, this is the greatest thing. And that's kind of how everyone sort of approaches that thing. Everyone is just a human learning. And so I think, are you ever gonna feel like you're ready enough? Probably not, no. People are spending money on you, and money talks loud, and so if they are willing to do that, that means you are good enough to them, and that's all that really matters. And then, I think another thing is like, who are they to judge you? They're also just figuring it out too. So everyone's just trying their best, and if they're giving you money, then you're doing it well.
I like to add to that. So for me, it's like, yeah, it never goes away, and I just embrace it. The reality is that what I've talked before, which is the sense of progression and being uncomfortable. That's what that is. And when you don't feel that, worry. I'll tell you that. So it's like, if you think you are top of everything, you're not learning anymore. You should feel uncomfortable or not know everything. The whole point is to feel this kind of uncomfortable, because that just means you're going to another place and you're learning new tools that are within yourself. So I embrace it. I don't think anybody's like about one bigger or the other. It's really about like, how can we collaborate and make something great? Yeah. And fail early and fail often. That's how I look at it. Because it's just like, it's not really about the perfection. Because you're really not going to get anywhere by doing that. It's really about pushing yourself out there as much as possible.
And I think a good piece of advice that I learned on this film was to take that voice, transition that voice from, oh man, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here, to, ha ha, I fooled them all.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions, so make them brilliant. Whoever it is.
Oh boy.
Okay.
What advice can you give us as young artists to become like you guys or different?
Yeah, advice I love to give. I've mentored a few when I was over the years. I've mentored a few kids and got from high school into college, and after they get through first year university, I always get the phone call saying, "Hey, can I come work for you now? I'm ready." And what I tell them is like, what I did after first year university? I worked at a bar. And I met the woman who's sitting over there who would eventually become my wife. And I got into trouble, and I had fun, and I learned how a bar works. And when we had to design a bar, I knew how a bar works. And I worked in construction, and I traveled, and I got arrested for doing graffiti. And I did all this very positive stuff your parents want to know about. But you're going to work on your drawing and painting nonstop. That's the must, but then live a life. So when you are shackled to your desk for 4 years like we are, you got something to draw on. Break a heart, get your heart broken, because I'm going to come to you one day. Octavio's going to say, you're the funniest person on this crew. You're doing the heartbreak scene now. You got to know what that really feels like, And the moment between George and Gwen in the movie, when we were working on that, I leveraged every fight I had with my wife and our and how we reconciled and put all of that from me into my little bit of contribution there. So you're gonna draw, you're gonna paint, become the best artist ever, but what you're gonna do is learn about your life and who you are and use that on screen.
Yeah, I would not just add to that as well. It's one of those things where it's like for me it's just practice, get better, practice. It's
Wake
not
up, practice.
yeah, it's one of those
Wake up,
things,
practice.
you know, and it's just on repeat because when that opportunity shows, it will show up when it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
There is no conventional. It's funny you're bringing that up. I was actually a biomajor for 2 years. I was going to become a dentist, and also I've worked as a PC consultant. I also was a bartender. I also was a jeweler. I also was a lot of different things. But the reality is I never stopped drawing and doing story and writing. So when it's ready and it will show up. You just got to keep moving in that direction. Don't look for that time clock. Just keep pushing yourself.
Yeah, when that opportunity knocks, like you say, then you are ready and ready to roll. Yeah.
I would say also, like, it's something I always give whenever I give portfolio reviews, is like learn to love the hard parts of the job. I think like one of the things that like I think kind of led to sort of more success on the movie for me personally was I made it known that I love doing drawovers and turns, both in a practical sense for like production, but like that's something that not a lot of designers like doing. And so if you can kind of learn to love to do that or love to do props, and you're a little bit more flexible with kind of what your range is, that really kind of helps kind of add to sort of your robustness. And kind of on the opposite side is like, if you're trying to like develop a portfolio or like what you want to do, gear towards what you want to do. Like if you want to be an action designer, don't design for like preschool, because it's like, if it's just not going to work for you, then there's no kind of point putting you in that because you're never going to be happy, right? I mean, unless you're willing to be open and try new things 100%, but like if you're really like, that's just not for me, I'm just not that person, then kind of don't sort of force yourself into a place in which you're not going to be happy because you're not going to do anything good. And it's probably going to just make you feel worse about it. So kind of like really sort of like learn and try to kind of go somewhere where this is what and who you want to be.